So my name is Ross Wallace. For those of you who were not here last year, I am a principal at a healthcare public affairs firm called ACCESS Health. So I work with organizations in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors on sort of strategy and policy challenges. And I've had the great pleasure of working with ACCESS for more than a year now, since before the last AGM. And I have a particular issue and interest in the subject we're about to talk about, which is basically the complex access landscape that bring innovative pharmaceuticals to the patients that need them. And in this particular context, innovative pharmaceuticals to the pediatric cancer patients and the care teams that need them. So this is an important, timely, and super complicated subject. But thankfully, we have some amazing, thoughtful, and experienced speakers who are going to kind of walk us through it. We're going to have some brief presentations from the panelists. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then the room will be yours, and you'll have an opportunity to ask them your own questions as we work towards about 5:10 or so. At that point, we'll be asking Dr. Fifi Liu to introduce Dr. Paul Hebert, and the final portion of today's kind of formal activities before we all move to lovely dinners will be an opportunity to hear from Paul Hebert in his role as the new president of CIHR. Okay, makes sense? That's what you guys think you're doing? That's why you think you're here? Okay, amazing. So I'm going to introduce all of our speakers in one fell swoop, and then they will come up one at a time and give their presentations. And then for those who are joining us online, as soon as the last presentation is done, we will all sit in this little fireside chat format, and then you'll be able to see us basically as we have the Q&A from the seats, rather than having to have folks come back up and sit down again. So hopefully that will be as visually simple for all of you in the room and also for all of you online. Okay, so without further ado, our first speaker is going to be Keith McIntosh. So Keith is the co-lead of the regulation, policy, and economic theme of ACCESS. So you're actually about to hear from folks who are not only leaders in their own sort of day jobs, but also leaders within ACCESS. And I think you're going to get different perspectives from that as well. So Keith is the chair of advocacy for Canadian Childhood Oncology Research Network, or ACORN. Keith founded ACORN in 2014 to advocate for translational research and effective treatment for all childhood and youth and adolescent cancers. Beyond that incredible work, he spent 20 plus years working in advocacy and policy. He's worked in multiple sectors, including in the pharmaceutical sector, particular relevance for today. And he's helped reduce regulatory burden and compliance costs and actually helped to accelerate impact in a lot of different ways. And he'll be reflecting on some of that experience today. Keith's son is a 7-year survivor of medulloblastoma, another highly relevant element of his story. So we'll be hearing from Keith first. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Avram Denburg. So Avi is the co-lead of the regulation, policy, and economics theme of ACCESS, another perspective. So beyond that, he received his medical degree at McMaster University in 2006, residency in pediatrics, and fellowship in hematology oncology at Sick Kids. He's studied and traveled and worked and fellowed around the world. I think of particular relevance, perhaps for this conversation, among his other affiliations is he sits as an academic member on the board of Canada's Drug Agency, which is an institution we will be hearing much about in the next sort of hour and a half or so. And probably many of you have already been thinking a little bit about its role in this important question of pharmaceutical access. So Abby will be speaker number 2. And then Dr. Paul Gibson. So Paul is co-lead of the Access to Innovative Therapies and Optimal Care theme at ACCESS. So yet another perspective from the ACCESS side of things. Paul's a graduate of Queen's Medical School. He's based at McMaster now, but again, like Avi and like many of you, has traveled and worked and fellowed in many parts of the country and beyond. He's also got a key role at POGO, the Pediatric Oncology Group of Ontario, Associate Medical Director. And finally, he's the chair of the management committee of the Cancer Young People in Canada, the National Pediatric Cancer Registry. So lots of perspectives there. And then finally, last but not least, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Supriya Sharma, who is the Health Canada Chief Medical Advisor, and will be offering some perspectives from Canada's national regulator. And as we were just talking about, Supriya has known about this opportunity for a handful of days, and she has come from Ottawa because most places are warmer than Ottawa right now. So thanks for coming in January, Supriya, and we're very pleased to have you. So we'll have Keith, then Avi, then Paul. Supriya will offer some remarks reflecting a bit on her own experience in the 3 presentations she will have heard along with all of you. And from there, we turn it over for a wide-ranging, inclusive, and energizing conversation, which is obviously up to all of you as well as these guys. So thanks very much, and Keith, to you.
Thank you, Ross. And no, not a daunting task to describe a incredibly complex and difficult topic, as you said. But hopefully I can do a little bit to simplify the process. This is a mixed audience with varying degrees of experience and interaction with access to drugs and the drug system. So there's substantial risk that I will either offer way too much detail or not nearly enough detail for your own perspective, but hopefully we can all kind of level set on how the system works. So I think I'm just going to know that. So I'll talk about a little bit about the drug development process, that many people in the room will be familiar with, orient ourselves in that process and so that we can see where and what pieces that I'll be talking about, the kinds of drug coverage that is available in Canada, focused on the public reimbursement system and the decision-making process that the public system has, a little bit about that landscape, a discussion about the timelines associated with it, and then a bit of perspective on how pediatric cancer and drugs for pediatric cancer interact with that system and how it makes it a little bit complicated. So this is a stolen slide, I will admit that. And most of the conversation that I'm going to have is, and what we'll be talking about, is to the right of the red dot. Once a drug is identified, once a drug is marketed and approved, then what happens? How do we actually get access to that drug? To the left and the far left, it really is that preclinical and discovery phase, often pre-competitive. So individual companies aren't competing with individual drugs, but there's a biological mechanism that they identify, and we want to find a drug that modifies that mechanism. The vast majority of drug access for children with cancer has been with the middle piece, that clinical research, right? Access to clinical trials, getting kids to the trials to kids. That's where access to therapy has mostly been in the discussion for children with cancer. We're seeing the benefit of drugs coming out of that clinical research. And now what? Now we have to get into the system, the access system, which is the normal process of, I'm a drug company, I have a new drug, I want to get it on market, I want to get it reimbursed. So I use this model to think, Swiss cheese. Each layer of cheese has different holes. Each layer of the system is designed to do something. These systems and these organizations didn't spring out of the earth. They were designed and built and enacted to solve a problem. Quite literally, is this snake oil, does it do anything? Is it safe? How do we keep people safe? How do we make decisions about what drugs to purchase, what drugs to prescribe, and what drugs should be paid for by the public system? Those are the things. And at the end of this process, right, the health system gets value from the drugs that they reimburse. So the system. At the bottom is relatively simple. Once the product has been approved and has market authorization, you're allowed to market as a drug company. I'm allowed to market it. We have a system, a dual market system, where there's a public market and a private market. Most people who are employed will have drug coverage, drug insurance through their employer, and it's approved. Generally speaking, you'll have some sort of coverage through your private insurance, and you can always pay cash. In the context of cancer and expensive drugs for cancer, very few people can look and pay those kinds of bills, but that's a possibility. What I'll be focusing on is the top line, which is the public system, right? We have multiple agencies or organizations, multiple places where different kinds of decisions can be made, right? So I'll be walking through sort of what those decisions are, what the organizations do, their intention, and the kinds of things that they think about. So if we start with Health Canada, right, and that's really the first step to putting a drug on the marketplace. And as a drug company, you'll submit to them for a market authorization. Health Canada is a large organization. Won't speak for Dr. Sharma, but it's a very large organization with within the government of Canada, has a minister and reports directly to the Minister of Health. There's a policy side of the organization responsible for things like pharmacare and the drug for rare disease, the funding flowing to the provinces for health services, et cetera. And there's the Health Products and Food Branch, which is the regulatory body within Health Canada, and they make decisions about drugs. So that includes clinical trial approvals and reviews, drug approvals, and post-market monitoring. So safety signals and adverse event reports, et cetera. When they're reviewing a drug, they're evaluating the results of clinical trials for safety, all of the safety issues. Is it harmful, right? Or is it safe to take? Does it efficacy? Does it do the thing that we expect it to do or want it to do? And then quality is the third leg of that stool. The manufacturing process, the ingredients, all of those things. For drugs for cancer, yeah, they're almost all not safe. But the question is, what is the balance between the benefit that it offers and the harms that it may cause, right? And that benefit risk or benefit harm profile, the benefit outweighs any harms that might be due. And that's it. No judgment on value, right? It's all about, does it do what it says on the box, and not too much harm, or an acceptable level of risk. Then we have health technology assessment, right? So this is currently the CDA, the Canada's Drug Agency, ACCESS in Quebec, and they ask a different question, more about that value for the health system. So I'll focus on the CDA. We can talk about ACCESS, very similar with some differences, as you might imagine. So the CDA is a nonprofit corporation governed and managed by and on behalf of Canada's health system, for lack of a better expression. And it's funded principally by Health Canada. The drug review side also substantially funded by industry user fees, and the provinces as well fund CDA. So I talked about what Health Canada measures and they're looking for. The HTA system is more about value and not about value. So they're assessing the clinical benefit or the additional clinical benefit against what may already be used or therapies that are available or that it's comparative to. We'll evaluate the economic considerations of those comparisons and how it fits within the current therapeutic landscape. So we're adding it to the system that exists or the process and the therapies that exist. How does it fit? Should we pay for it, or should the public drug plans pay for it? When CDA makes a decision, it's not really a decision, it's a recommendation, non-binding, as they're very clear in their documentation. It's advice, and so they provide advice to the their constituents and their clients, which are the public drug plans. The decision may be do not list, do not fund, or fund with conditions. almost all fund with conditions today. Once that recommendation, so long as it's a positive recommendation, list with conditions, the next step is an organization called PCPA, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. So that's evolved over the last decade now, I guess, and is now a formal organization. It's not a shadow realm anymore. It is similar to CDA. It's a not-for-profit corporation. Members are the public drug plans and Health Canada, with board of directors, et cetera. Funded by a transfer of funds. They currently have a pile of money that was transferred to them from the previous organization, and for the next few years will run based on that funding. I guess to be determined how future funding. They can choose to negotiate. Their role is to negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies a listing agreement. So under what terms, listing conditions, and price that a drug will be reimbursed based on the input of the recommendation from CDA. They may choose to pick up a negotiation or not. So that's one opportunity where a reimbursement process may get stopped or continue. When they pursue a negotiation, sometimes, most of the time, an agreement will be concluded, but occasionally they'll go through negotiation and there will be no conclusion. So assuming that there's a positive conclusion of a negotiation, again, it's a non-binding letter of intent. So there is an agreement and a letter of intent between the pharmaceutical companies and PCPA on behalf of the provincial drug plans, the public drug plans, an agreement and an outline of terms. But then that LOI, the letter of intent, has to be translated into a formal agreement between each of the drug plans and the pharmaceutical company. Within the reason for that is that each province has their own legislation and regulations and format and structure for their plans. And so it's not possible to have one agreement. It's really what it is. So then that last piece is that translation from the LOI to a listing agreement. And that's that formal contract between a provincial drug plan and a drug company. So I cannot possibly go into the complexities of individual provincial drug plans. We'll be here for the rest of our lives. I think, so it's fair to say that it really, really is dependent on the province you're in. And for cancer, it gets even more complicated. Some provinces have everything bucketed under the provincial cancer care program, in where that formulary covers more or less everybody, and anything cancer related gets flows through that bucket. That's the most simple case. Other provinces, Ontario is probably one of them, that is much more complicated, where you have a basket and a multitude of programs and drug plans that cover different things, whether it's a hospital formulary, a public drug plan formulary, a cancer formulary, a catastrophic drugs formulary, etc. So even once you get listed, it's still complicated. I think I'll leave it there. So how long does this take? This is just after market authorization. So this is the reimbursement process. The Health Canada process is about a year. 300 days is the standard for a standard drug review, but fair to call it a year for a market authorization. I'm a drug company, I file a new drug application, 300 days, a year. It's a fair number. There are lots of folks who will measure time and the time to listing. It's complicated and there are lots of disagreement. It's fair to say CDA, the HTA process takes about a year if we're thinking about it conceptually. So about a year for Health Canada's review, about a year for HTA review, and that includes time to file and the middle time periods. And then it can take up to a year for PCPA. Over time, as the number of files has increased and through the pandemic, time has sort of shifted from the HTA process to the negotiation process. There's some discussion that it's now taking longer to negotiate than to review the economics. A year is sort of a fair way to think of it conceptually. And then that period of time after the HTA or after the LOI arrives, some provinces are much quicker than others to list. So, perspective. Pediatric cancer. Well, drug development process. It doesn't always begin at the discovery. The clinical research may begin, right, once the drug is approved. So that shifts everything. The process expects a sponsor. It needs a drug company to push it through. So, right, a new drug submission or a supplemental submission is $300,000, $100,000 for a HTA review with CDA, and need somebody to negotiate a listing. Scale. US FDA has approved about 600 novel medicines for cancer in 25 years, 30 with a pediatric indication. 70% of those pediatric indications are since 2015. So there isn't that much experience dealing with pediatric indications. CDA has done about 350 cancer reviews. Acorn has participated in 14 pediatric indication reviews, 5 of them for one drug. CDA doesn't really have experience or practice dealing with pediatric indications. So, right, there's a purpose and there's design to accomplish something. They're not quite designed for what we're hoping for them to do. Sorry.
Thank you, Keith. Okay, folks, so as Abby's getting up, I'm going to just gently suggest that we're going to hold questions until we've heard from all of our speakers, because I imagine that your questions will get more nuanced and some of them may even get answered along the way. So if you're okay with that, we will have that much more time for a robust and engaging session once we're done all of the formal remarks. All right, Abby, thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Okay, so clear as mud? I actually think, Keith, you did a totally masterful job describing a complex system. Keith focused primarily on the Swiss cheese overall, and I think it's my job to try to get a sense, give you guys a sense of where those holes do and don't line up for pediatrics in particular. And I'm shamelessly stealing my intellectual theft for the day is also from Patrick, who I don't see anymore. But this is a quote that he relayed to me some ages ago in the context of a qualitative study, that in thinking about childhood cancer, and in particular drug access in childhood cancer, the problem is big enough and the problem is small enough. In other words, this is a big problem for us in our community in terms of getting access to both traditional and novel therapies in our space based on the evidence that we generate to treat the children that we care about. But also the problem is bounded enough, it's tractable enough in relation to the size of our population and the collective nature of our community that we can actually do something about it. and that will have positive knock-on effects for other, there you are, Patrick, for other communities in the pediatric space, in the rare disease space, and in the broader health system who are facing comparable problems. So we have an opportunity, I think, to lead. I'm going to try to go a bit quickly because I want to make sure we've got time for Paul and Supriya as well. And if there's any questions about particular stuff, we can circle back. So Sandra, this is my second intellectual theft of the day. I stole this from you with thanks. Some really elegant work that Sandra and others have done with Daniel and other members of our community in thinking about innovative access requests for drugs for kids with cancer in Canada, and looking at kind of for what diseases, what molecular targets, how long did it take, and importantly, what mechanism of access. And what I wanted to highlight in this bar graph that Sandra generated is really the variance across provinces and territories in terms of how children are getting access to these agents. So sometimes it's through compassionate supply from manufacturers, sometimes it's through, as Keith mentioned, private health insurance plans and coverage, sometimes it's through discretionary hospital funding, and sometimes it's through provincial public plans. And you can see that variance. You can see in Ontario, it's almost exclusively through compassionate access programs, which speaks to a huge malalignment of our healthcare system. So I'll present you a couple of summative slides that really, I think, encapsulate the problem. We'll go into some nitty gritty, but really, if there's any takeaways, it's in these first few slides. The first thing I think I want to emphasize is that, as I think I intimated, we're not unique in childhood cancer, although there's some specificity to childhood cancer in terms of drug access. This is a broader pediatric problem and a rare disease problem. It's a function of research-related challenges in generating evidence for rare diseases, and this relates to the problem that I like to call the ubiquity of rarity in pediatrics. Most rare diseases occur in children, and many children have rare diseases. So, uniquely, individually, these diseases are rare, but in aggregate, this is the problem that largely faces most pediatric research and clinical trials conduct. There's also historically been difficulties in doing clinical trials in kids as a result of ethical concerns for the conduct of research in children. Those have largely, if not fallen away, been attenuated, but that has set up evidentiary challenges and frankly, practical challenges that have really limited the number of trials done in kids over time. And that has had, again, effects in terms of whether or not manufacturers, Keith says you need someone to push a drug through a system, have the incentive or are compelled to conduct trials to generate evidence in children, and it has circumscribed public funding for pediatric trials generally. All of that has led to limited evidence, and this is further compounded when you think not only about kids, but as we start to think about precision medicine, where our traditional disease nosology is further fractured by mechanism of action-based drug indications because of molecular targets. So that has set up a real bottleneck for the development of efficacious therapies in kids that are funded in our health system. What's less often talked about is the way that politics and values inhere in this conversation and limit access or design of the system to inform access for kids in Canada and frankly in many comparator jurisdictions. And the result is few pediatric indications, as Keith talked about, a raft of off-label prescribing and limited formulary listings. I think I'm going to skip that quickly and just give you a sort of a 10,000-foot view of a way I like to think about some of the major dynamics and challenges that govern access to cancer drugs for kids here. And the first way I think about that is really at the health system level, all along the pharmaceutical value chain. So along that whole sort of sequential pathway that Keith talked about. For industry, and I think Keith intimated this, there are really constrained market dynamics around sort of the political economy of whether or not to make a drug for kids and generate that evidence for a pediatric indication that leaves us evidence light for many of the indications we care about. At the regulatory level, and I think Supriya will talk about some exciting stuff, I hope, that Health Canada is doing in this space. Really focused on evidence of safety and efficacy, and there is often little reason for that sponsor, the manufacturer, to generate pediatric data to support the adjudications of safety and efficacy that Health Canada has to do. And we can talk about some legislation that's trying to right that ship. At the level of HTA, again, the need for a sponsor. So there are very, very few non-sponsored, in other words, non-manufacturer driven submissions to CDA and to provincial HTA bodies that really limit the ability of these HTA bodies to review for pediatric indications. And the priority setting processes for review, that whole pipeline that informs that long timeline between market approval and actual funding, is dictated at the HTA level anyway by some criteria for priority setting that aren't well calibrated for kids. It's things like burden of illness at a population level that dictate that, and that really usually works against us. And then finally, and I think Keith, you gave a good flavor of this too, there's a whole political environment out there, a whole bunch of exogenous factors in terms of the political and health system priorities that payers need to consider when they're funding the things that need to be funded in a health system. And there's lots of opportunity costs there. And our little world of pediatric cancer shows up only occasionally. In terms of HTA specifically, we can go into this in more detail, but basically there's evidentiary, economic, and ethical challenges in the way that HTA is done generally, that is, makes it poorly fit for children, and makes those determinations of value that Keith talked about really hard to do. And we'll maybe touch quickly on some attempts to right-size that as well. So all of that results in, I think, what Keith ended on, which is limited and across the country inequitable access for cancer drugs for kids. So Paul and I have talked about this a lot. I think both of us and many others like to think in terms of archetypes of drugs to give this some more practical specificity. So if we take three kinds of archetypes, you can start to see some of the problems. So the first is drugs that are developed in adults and often, usually later in pediatrics for the same indication. A good example of this is brentuximab vedotin for Hodgkin's lymphoma. And here's an issue where really it's about making sure that we get kids included in joint trials with adults usually. So we sort of go along with manufacturer incentives for conducting these trials, and that we ensure that where children aren't adequately included or only included in a small subset, that we think carefully about extrapolation of data to pediatric indications, whether or not that's reasonable and safe, and where it is, to do that in the absence of uniquely conducted pediatric trials. A second archetype is drugs developed in adults and children for different indications. An example of this might be crizotinib for non-small cell lung cancer in adults, but for neuroblastoma in kids. And here we have a bigger problem. So here it's really the adult market and incentive that drives both the indication that's submitted to Health Canada and to HTA bodies and the initial price. And in some contexts, there's a risk of industry flight due to price renegotiation for a subsequent pediatric indication. And here's where we really need to both incentivize, so with a carrot, and compel with a stick, the generation of pediatric specific data by manufacturers through things like differential pricing, patent extensions, mandated investigational plans, and other things, some of which have been undertaken in other jurisdictions like the US and the EU, and starting to happen in Canada, to really try to incentivize the development of pediatric data. And then the third archetype is those drugs, those orphan drugs that are really only developed for our pediatric patients, like dinutuximab for neuroblastoma. And here the problem is arguably greatest. It's a super bounded market. There's really high startup costs a lot of the time. There's limited return on investment by virtue of that bounded market. So there's therefore higher prices. And there's real evidence generation challenges with greater uncertainty for both regulators and in particular, HTA bodies. So what this usually means is weaker value for money propositions at the level of HTA review and for payers. And here's where I think we need to be really creative and think about more expansive definitions of value. What does it mean to be of value to patients and health systems when we conduct HTA to take better account of the realities of rare disease and childhood cancer? Okay, this is a super busy slide. I'm just going to try to give you a flavor of some ways that systems in Canada included have started to recognize these problems and try to adapt to them. We have a long way to go, but there's early signs, I think, for hope. And this is a slide from the Canadian Council of Academies work on medications in kids and access to them in Canada from over a decade ago now, that really tried to get at this problem of evidentiary uncertainty from clinical trials in the pediatric space and think about how to adapt our trials to innovate, to generate robust data that can inform regulatory approvals. So it's really busy, but what I wanted you just to take away is that Health Canada and other bodies are thinking creatively about how to adapt our traditional hierarchies of evidence-based medicines, where we focus on randomized phase 3 blinded comparative clinical trials, to adaptive, flexible designs including things like basket trials, umbrella trials, and platform trials, as well as other adaptive designs with which many of you will be familiar. We're doing this in real life in the context of our community in Access and in Profile. This is a slide courtesy of Rebecca Dayel and at BC Children's that summarizes some attempts to do this in the context of Profile with different kinds of basket and platform trials and individual patient protocols to try to get access to unique drugs based on molecular targets in individual patients to try to innovate in this evidence space. So another major area that I intimated is using policy, using legislation as policy to try to correct some of these problems. And here's where there's really been a movement internationally in both the EU and the FDA over time to try to articulate policy through legislation that both, again, incentivizes and compels manufacturers to generate pediatric investigational plans and data and gives them good carrots and good sticks to make sure that that happens. This has been successful in increasing the percentage of submissions that do include pediatric data, but it's been a drop in the bucket. So still, as I think Keith spoke to in the US and also in Europe, there have been, I think in the US it's something like 14, and in Europe something like 16 pediatric indications that have come through since pediatric regulation, by way of example, in 2007 in Europe. For these, the reason for most of them have gone through is really because it was an adult market that drove the incentive to submit that drug, and the sponsor wanted to get the pediatric data out there because they wanted the adult drug to come to market. Many waivers, we can talk about this a bit more, have been sought in the context of those submissions to say, you know what, this drug's actually not relevant for kids, so we're not going to do a pediatric investigational plan because this drug's only relevant in lung cancer and kids don't get lung cancer. The problem with that, of course, is in a precision medicine era, these are really mechanism of action-based indications, and they're missing many of the pediatric indications there. Okay, another busy slide. I think I'll save some of this to our discussion with Supriya, but basically this is an attempt to begin to compare Canada and some other jurisdictions from a regulatory, HTA, and payment perspective in terms of, do they have special provisions for kids or for rare diseases? Because some countries really frame this in terms of the rare and orphan space. And what innovative mechanisms are they kind of looking at to be able to do this better for children? And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that Supriya may touch on that I think Health Canada is beginning to trial and do. One is a pilot of a pediatric rule. So that's basically, again, an attempt to do this incentive for manufacturers to submit pediatric data along with their submissions. There's also a precision regulation initiative that seeks to leverage new legislative reforms of the Food and Drug Act to empower basically the minister to make orders for specific drugs based on unmet need in Canada to get over barriers to submission and to enable, importantly, reliance on other stringent regulatory authorities like the EMA and the US FDA to streamline regulatory approval in Canada. So those are a couple of things that are happening at the level of Health Canada as part of a pediatric drug action plan. There's some more things. Maybe Supriya will speak to some of those. And then finally, I wanted to highlight at CDA, I think something that is just getting going, but has the opportunity, I think, to do justice to the need for flexibility we have in our pediatric space, which is a new committee called FMEC. It's not the most catchy committee title, Formulary Management Expert Committee, that's trying to be a bit of an innovative sandbox for thinking about how to do HTA differently in the context of non-sponsored submissions and in the context of pediatric and rare diseases. Okay, I think I'm going to burn through some of this. The last thing I'll focus on maybe is, again, just in the HTA space, some of these HTA bodies have recognized this problem. They're not totally blind to it. And they're trying to figure out, in the context of a much broader health system that has lots of needs, how to innovate in this unique space. And I think increasingly they're doing that by thinking about widening the value lens. So looking at other outcome measures beyond things like the basic efficacy and safety that regulation has typically been premised on, and that some of our HTA submissions are typically premised on, and beyond straight value for money propositions like number of qualities, cost per quality, to things like, what do experts say about this drug in clinical context? What do patients and families say? And what do general publics feel are important through a variety of methods, be it qualitative engagement, be it through multi-criteria decision analysis or discrete choice experiments, or perhaps most importantly, through the generation of patient-reported outcome measures. Here's a snapshot of one example of how we at SickKids are trying to make HTA child size by creating an HTA framework with input from patients and families and general publics that is much more calibrated to a wider set of values that are relevant to child health. We can talk more about that. And I think I just wanted to sort of end on patient-reported outcome measures. This was touched on in the context of the psychosocial presentation earlier today. Patient-reported outcome measures are increasingly being understood as an absolutely essential component of regulatory and HTA submissions, understanding the value of a therapy from a patient's perspective, from a variety of different metrics. And these are increasingly being required in the EU and by the FDA in submissions and these other jurisdictions. They're not particularly always being done well. And I think that's an area we all have an opportunity to collectively improve on. We're trying to do this in the context, again, of our Profile Precision Oncology initiative in terms of collecting longitudinal data on patient-reported outcomes. I think there's an array of emerging policy options we can talk about. Maybe I'll save those for the discussion to give others time. I just wanted to end again with a plea for us as a community to really think about pediatrics not only as a neglected space, but a unique and protected space, an opportunity to innovate in terms of policy and in terms of health system reforms that can not only help kids with cancer, but actually can help reform our system for kids and people with rare diseases more broadly. So I'll end there and look forward to Paul's talk.
Great. Thanks so much, Avi. Paul.
Thanks, Avi. And I just wanted to point out, I noticed that Patrick, Avi gave you credit for the quote when he spoke it, but he also referenced himself. So Patrick, if you know any legal measures that may follow down there. And because I haven't made fun of Avi enough, I'll just point out that how hard it is to follow when Avi uses words like archetype and I talk about buckets. But I did want to take really the really informative presentations by both Keith and Avi and bring it home a little bit to some of the practical that's happening right now. And I want to focus on the voice of stakeholders, and I'm going to focus particularly on CDA submissions, recognizing that we've had references to the ACCESS process in Quebec, and it's parallel but not the same. But I will just want to focus on this and really how we've had some experience handling these various buckets that come with this. And I'm going to start talking about these pediatric specific indications, and just like Avi used Danyatuximab as an example. So this is a time when it's a pediatric drug. In order to get the pediatric drug into Canada and funded in Canada, there had to be a pharma-driven pediatric specific. So we look back, and in 2010 was a really exciting time for many of us that remember when word came from the COG that this difference in this clinical trial has shown really new hope in neuroblastoma. And so in 2010, we saw this. And it took some time to come, but when we did have the CADITH at the time, or PCODER review for Danyatuximab, is that we really saw the strong voice of clinician and people with lived experience coming into here. And I really point to the Danyatuximab feedback about how they really thanked the feedback that came from patient and family experience and really registered that into it. And with that coming through, it came forward with a positive funding recommendation, but I'll also highlight the year that happened. So in 2010, we knew this was the right thing to do. And in 2019, we had a final funding recommendation. So moving on to another bucket and an example, and this is an example now of that we've said where there's the same indication. We know that biologically these are not identical diseases, but gemtuzumab in AML, brentuximab in Hodgkin lymphoma, blinatumomab in B-cell ALL. These are all diseases that kids and adults get, and so they have the same indication. And I want to show and hopefully take you away with a little optimism on how the process has come along this way by first starting with something maybe less optimistic. So again, coming back to an example of where we sort of knew the right thing to do. And so this looks back to the study AAML 0531. This was when gemtuzumab was shown to have value in upfront AML. And
it became again, after the advice of the COG, the de facto standard of care for children treated in North America for AML. And in 2019, as gemtuzumab gained more following and interest again in adults, there was a submission made that initially went to CADIF for AML for 15 and older. And so 15 and older wasn't great. It's catching a little bit of our AYA population, but we really had the chance to come and say, well, hey, how does this matter for kids? This is the standard of care for kids too. There was a submission from a POGO group that was authored by myself, and many of my colleagues were provide their support for that. There was also a patient and family expression brought in by the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. But when we look what happened there is it came back with a positive funding example, but this time they moved to the Health Canada indication. And so not even 15 and up, but the funding recommendation came for 18 and up. And this is still a problem that we continue to struggle with in funding gemtuzumab. And we know that province by province, it differs to that. But in many centers right now, to still live up to that pediatric standard of care, hospitals are having to turn to their global budgets because we're missing that reimbursement pathway for gemtuzumab as an example. Frustrating, same disease, good evidence to show so, and still nothing to drive it through. But maybe we're getting better, because I do bring up the example of brentuximab and Hodgkin lymphoma. And many will know that there have been many adult studies with the upfront use of brentuximab. But importantly, there was also a COG study that had really exciting results, that we saw improved outcomes adding brentuximab. And in 2023, after this 2022 publication, is that there was a CDA submission made for the use of brentuximab with the so-called adult backbone, using twice as much brentuximab based on the Echelon adult studies. So again, we look, the opportunity was up there for feedback. And there was a patient group submission from Lymphoma Canada. Interestingly, we didn't have the pediatric voice heard in that particular submission from a patient and family experience to it. There were two clinician groups. One of them was POGO, one was the CCO hematology group with this. But what we did on the Ontario side is we said, hey, same indication, and we have the evidence for it too. And this was a sign of maybe times are changing, because what we heard back this time was, you're right, we should look at that part. And we were happy to hear the word that that in the setting, even though it had been asked to say, let's just look at this adult way, this adult protocol, that there was an agreement from CDA to actually look into the pediatric indications on this part. And importantly, it came forward and it did get the recommendation to fund, and to fund not only for the adults 18 and older, but also those inclusion criteria for the pediatric experience too. So I point that out as, hey, we're getting there with time maybe. We had no answer with the AML story, but now more modernly, we've been able to have the input and make our way to make things go better. And now maybe what's one of the most exciting ways of steps of things moving forward is everyone loves to talk about blinatumomab, because we've had a very exciting last 12 months with blinatumomab. And I think that in the spring of last year, there was the pharma company was preparing this adult submission based on really exciting adult data on this E1910 study, showing that there was good evidence for using blina upfront in adults. And then many will remember in July 24, COG let the members know that the 1731 trial had been stopped, that there were these really exciting results, but they were to be confidential until they were released at ASH in December. Worst kept secret in pediatrics. But I think what was important is that the COG was part of, recognized this not just as a Canadian issue, but really for funding and regulators around the world. And so while the results remain confidential, there was this confidential memo that went out to regulatory agents and insurers sharing those results. And thankfully, with this cooperation, Amgen was agreeable to change their current submission to include the pediatric data. And probably equally as exciting was this idea of using a rolling submission structure that I think and I'm not 100% sure, but I think it dates back to COVID medication review, but this rolling submission to essentially allow the adult submission data to go in and the pediatric data to be able to follow it as it became public through December. And so at this time, again, there was the opportunity for feedback from persons with people with lived experience, including ACORN, OPAC, and Leukemia Lymphoma Society, and POGO submitted there too. But now we wait and see. Because what is important to notice is that we've got lots and lots and lots of data now supporting the use of this drug, but there's still some extrapolation to be done. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in the next year to see, are we going to get to the point where we have a recommendation and all those other elements in the Swiss cheese that Keith talked about? Are we going to get there to when we think all the kids who should be getting this are getting it in a reimbursed and funded way? So last one I want to talk about is this bucket of adult drugs where we found a use in kids. And I think that there's lots of examples of these repurposed drugs in pediatric cancer. And as Avi has already sort of told us, that as we learn more and more about molecular mechanisms, you can see more and more of this coming. So I put lots of examples here: nelarabine in T-cell ALL, crizotinib or lorlatinib in neuroblastoma, various TKIs in osteosarcoma, and of course, targeted agents in low-grade glioma brain tumors too. And so what do we do when there's little to no interest in pharma to drive these indications forward? Keith told us how much money and resource has to go in to do that. And the process prior to the FMEC process that Avi mentioned was there if clinicians wanted to do it. But what it takes to do that summary was a big lift. And I really highlight that one of the biggest challenges with this is this idea of needing a study of the evidence, a summary of the evidence, comparing it to what works in other ways, which I must say as clinicians, well, what if we do with this and what if we do with this, and bringing those together and to say which is the best recommendation, we're pretty familiar with that. But pharmacoeconomic reviews, I don't know about everyone else in their training and those who are health professionals. I didn't get any economics lectures in med school. And I think this really sits to where this big lift is in finding value for the system that we just don't have at our disposal. Nevertheless, so the story I'll tell is nelarabine in T-cell ALL, where again, an example of a randomized clinical trial, phase 3 trial that showed an important use that changed the standard of care in 2020. And this was a time that recognizing there was really no interest in the pharma side of things. This was a drug that had been approved in, I think, 2008 for third-line use, and there wasn't really a lot of interest beyond that. So POGO, we undertook with the will and really the charity of many others' time, we took about doing a POGO clinical submission or clinician-driven submission for this. We were thankful to have a patient and family feedback. We're also thankful to colleagues from coast to coast who put their clinical feedback into this too. And we were really happy to see that nelarabine did get a positive recommendation and now facilitating its funding across the country. And we learned it's possible. We also learned that it's too much. It was literally hundreds upon hundreds of hours to make this happen. And when we look across the spectrum of pediatrics, where all our needs are, we can't expect our clinicians to drive each one of these to come. But we heard a little bit, and Avi already mentioned this idea of the Formulary Management Expert Committee, which I still can never remember. That's why it's written out in particular, because I don't actually know what that means in that way. But it is these single drugs that are later in their life cycle and allows these streamlined reviews of these individual indications. There's lots of examples right now in pediatric cancer, and this is one of the exciting parts to be up here and say this, is that we have Blina in relapse. For brain tumors right now, there's a dabrafenib and trametinib in V600E low-grade gliomas, regorafenib in metastatic osteosarcoma, and also sort of excitingly in a really freshly new data is the use of nivolumab in high-risk Hodgkin lymphoma. All of these are still in process, and I hope we're here next year to say, boy, that works great. One of the things that they're not coming with the clear economic data. So Keith stressed that these are non-binding recommendations, and how those provincial payers are going to take these recommendations and make them happen. I sure hope it's going to be a good story, but wait and see. So it still is the process it's a challenging process, and we have to keep going to make sure that we're getting the access that we need of these. And in the absence of a transformational process that really puts the kids and those other things at the center, we have to continue to participate and find our ways in the system that we have. And we really have to make sure that the experiences of our clinicians, but equally, if not more importantly, of our patients and family experiences there, so that we're continuing to drive this reimbursement equity across the country.